Today's guest on the Think Wildlife podcast is Dr. Abi T. Vanak, a conservation scientist and policy expert and the director of the Center for Policy Design at ATREE. Dr. Vanak has extensively worked on India's grasslands and open natural ecosystems, invasive species, and forest governance, particularly at the science policy interface. His work has been instrumental in reframing how we think about so-called wastelands in India and highlighting the importance of biodiversity, livelihoods, and climate resilience.
Well, welcome Abi to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, what got you interested into conservation and research?
From a fairly young age, I was interested in animals. And, like most young children who are interested in animals, they tend to keep pets. So I had a variety of pets at home, from rabbits and ducks and dogs to tortoises, fish, and sometimes even snakes, much to the horror of my parents and friends. But it's only when I was in middle school that I found out that one could actually make a career out of this. And so then I got fairly involved with activities such as the nature club in my school. I then went to several camps that were organized by the World Wildlife Foundation, or WWF as it's called now. And then I had an opportunity to interact with Dr. Ravi Chalam, who was at that time doing his PhD on lions. And he was very kind enough to guide me on what was the career stream required to, or what was the education stream required to get into a career in ecology and wildlife sciences. So that's what I followed. Then I did a master's. I did a bachelor's in zoology from the Loyola College in Chennai, which is where I grew up, and then went on to do a master's in wildlife science from the Wildlife Institute of India. But all along the way, I was also, doing internships. I worked. I used to run transects in the Giri National Park. I used to be a very active part of the Student Sea Turtle Conservation Network in Chennai, which really shaped my career and got me into, brought me in touch with a whole host of future conservationists and conservation leaders. So that was my early experience and my childhood years developing my interest in wildlife into a full-fledged career as a conservation scientist.
So, you're a director of ATREE's Center for Policy Design. So, what exactly is the center about, and what are the main projects being worked upon?
So the Center for Policy Design at ATREE was started about 5 years ago. So ATREE is a 30-year-old organization with a fairly deep interdisciplinary philosophy of research and practice. And, there's a lot of wonderful work that has been done in ATREE over the years. And it was felt that it needs to have more systematic policy impact. And so therefore a dedicated center was set up to further improve or work on the science policy practice interface in ATREE's core areas of research and action. And so that's how the center was formed. And since I was one of the first directors of the center, and we've been working to build the agenda for the center. So what we do currently is we focus on a few thematic areas. One of the main thematic areas that we focus on is something that's close to my heart as well, which is open natural ecosystems in India. So these are the savanna, grasslands, deserts, rocky outcrops, and other naturally non-forested landscapes, which have so far been ignored in both the conservation as well as the policy framework, conservation policy framework of India. In fact, perversely, they are part of the policy framework in promoting the active destruction of these landscapes by labeling them as wastelands. So the center has a focus on reversing this narrative and on bringing the value of India's open natural ecosystems into the popular limelight, but definitely the policy mainstream narrative, so that their biodiversity values, their climate resilience values, and their livelihood values can be better appreciated and promoted by the government. Other areas of focus at CPD are on invasive species, again, an area of long-standing research at ATREE, and on forest rights and governance. This is again something that has been the core area of ATREE's focus. ATREE has been a pioneer in ensuring that rights are awarded to forest dwelling communities, and how they manage forests is then done through a democratic participative process. So these are currently our main areas of focus. We obviously work on multiple other things, but we're building a capacity to engage with them in a more full-fledged manner.
So talking about open natural ecosystems, what exactly is an open natural ecosystem and how are they different from grasslands?
So grasslands are one kind of open natural ecosystem. So when we coined this term, so this is a term that my colleague Dr. M.D. Madhusudan and I had coined when we were starting to map out India's grasslands and savannas and deserts. And we basically, this is a challenge that I had been sort of thinking about and mulling since my early PhD days, when I did a PhD looking at the ecology of Indian foxes and their space in the mesocarnivore communities of India. And I noticed that the grasslands that they inhabit are not part of mainstream conservation narratives. And that's when I realized that actually the policy is to label them as wastelands. And so I started exploring further on how do we now bring this into the mainstream. So I realized that any vegetation map of India does not actually have savannas or semi-arid savannas and grasslands as part of the maps. They have only some high altitude shola grasslands or terai grasslands that are classified as grasslands. All the other areas are called scrub forest or temperate thorn forest or tropical thorn forest or dry scrub or something like that. And I realized that this is a huge lacuna in our understanding of these systems. Because having worked in other countries as well, including the US and in South Africa, our ecosystems are very similar to African savannas. But here we don't call them savannas. So when Dr. Madhusudan and I we were working together to map out these landscapes at a high resolution, we decided to club all of these into one omnibus category that we called the open natural ecosystems. And the reason we called it as open because it's naturally treeless. It's not a forest. It's not tree dominated. It's natural because this is the underlying biogeographic characteristic of this landscape. The rainfall or other climatic conditions prevent high tree growth here. So it's supposed to be like this. It's not a degraded landscape, or certainly not a degraded forest. And so we call this the ONEs of India, and these include the deserts of Western Rajasthan and Kutch in Gujarat. It includes the savanna grasslands of central India and of peninsular India, the Deccan Plateau. It includes some areas that are currently classified as scrub forest or open dry deciduous forest. So including the lower elevation areas of the Nilgiris and the Western Ghats Mountains, areas in central India, the Vindhyan ranges, so on and so forth. So many of these are now classified by us as open natural ecosystems. So anything that you expect to see in an African savanna, you can also expect to see in Indian savannas.
So as you mentioned earlier, these ecosystems are often considered wastelands. So how did this misconception originate? And what impact has it had on open natural ecosystem conservation?
So this categorization as wasteland is actually a British colonial legacy that we have continued to pass down in modern India. The British, when they came to India, they saw our natural resources from two perspectives. Either the forests were a source of timber, or they could be cleared for agriculture. Both of these were revenue generating. And if something was not revenue generating, according to them, then as per the prevalent British philosophy and British thinking on land rights and private ownership, it was lying waste. And so therefore these areas were defined as wastelands. And even now in revenue records and state revenue records, you'll see the category culturable wasteland and non-culturable wasteland. The government of India post-independence continued this classification because obviously they were heavily influenced by the foresters who were at that time defining what was a natural ecosystem in India. And so it was mostly a forest-centric narrative, because our focus also was on, especially when the focus turned to wildlife conservation in India, the focus was on large charismatic fauna such as tigers and elephants and so on. And those are obviously associated with forest areas. Little heed was paid at that time to the non-forest dominant species such as great Indian bustards, the Indian wolf, black buck, the now extinct but reintroduced cheetah. So that habitat, of course, then was actively promoted for conversion to other kinds of uses. And so this wasteland categorization persisted. The government formed a National Wasteland Development Board, which was then taken over by the Ministry of Rural Development under the Department of Land Resources. They then commissioned the National Remote Sensing Center to create something called the Wasteland Atlas of India. And this continues. The last one, I think, was published in 2019. And I believe now under the National Geospatial Mission, the NRSC is updating its wasteland categorization or its wasteland mapping. So we are pushing very hard to ensure that grasslands and savannas are not categorized as wastelands, because it has had very deleterious impacts on the conservation of these landscapes and in fact on the recognition of these landscapes as important. So if anything is classified as wasteland, then the first area of conversion to for any other uses, whether it's industrial, agriculture, solar energy plants, or whatever it is, the first target is always the wasteland which is available in each district. And this is what the collector of each district is supposed to report to the central government. So we want to really change this narrative. We want to highlight how important these so-called wastelands are to India's climate resilience, to meet India's Paris Agreement targets, for our biodiversity conservation, as well as the livelihoods of millions of people.
So talk about why open natural ecosystems are so important, both socio-economically and ecologically.
So thinking that we worked along with various partners, for example, the Center for Pastoralism based in Delhi, organization called Sehjeevan based in Bhuj, and many others working throughout the country, is that pastoralism itself as a means of livelihood has been invisibilized for many decades. And again, this started with the British. The British thought that nomadic people were a problem because they could not be controlled. You couldn't levy a tax on them. You didn't know where to find them. Many of them were classified as robber tribes and so on. But in fact, what they were doing was they were practicing a highly ecologically adaptable or adaptive system of livelihood, which, as is now recognized the world over, is pastoralism. Basically, you are not tied to any one climatic regime. You move with the rain, because India, as you know, is a rain deficient country, and many years you can have severe droughts, and therefore agriculture is not possible in many of these landscapes. So the most resilient form of livelihood is to then raise livestock that can move with the rains and obtain their foraging needs through whatever little is available in the ground. Unfortunately, this has not been really mainstreamed even in our agricultural economic model. The studies that have been done have now shown that the annual economic contribution of free range pastoralism or extensive livestock keeping is almost 1.3 lakh crores. And that's a very significant part of the agricultural GDP. It does not even get accounted for in India's numbers. Excuse me. And there are millions of people who are dependent on this for their primary source of livelihood, and many millions more who are dependent on this as a secondary source of livelihood. So it's really important that we recognize that these livelihoods are persisting on these marginal lands, and that the government that all of this is revenue and livelihoods are being generated with almost zero government support. The government doesn't give any subsidy, unlike agriculture, which gets thousands of crores of rupees in fertilizer subsidy or in irrigation of facilities and so on. Extensive livestock keeping gets no subsidies. So this is only win-win for the government, and yet we seem to undervalue this. So we want to bring this, I want to highlight this, and there's no better time to do it than now, because the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has declared 2026 as the International Year for Rangelands and Pastoralism. And so this year there's a huge push to promote pastoralism, to recognize it, and to protect and conserve the rangelands that pastoralists depend on.
So talk about how classifying open natural ecosystems correctly can benefit the conservation of endangered species such as the Indian wolf or the great Indian bustard.
See, only if you recognize something of its correctly will you value it. If something has been classified as a wasteland, then the imagination is that it should be put to more productive uses. Correct? And this is where there's been a sort of mismatch between India's conservation philosophy, its legislation, and the practice on the ground. Now, on the one hand, we have provided species such as the great Indian bustard, the lesser florican, the Indian wolf, the black buck, etc., the highest category of protection under Indian law, Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act. But somehow, because the jurisdiction of wildlife comes under the Forest Department, the assumption has been that it's only forests that will also harbor these species, although everybody knows that these are mostly grassland species or savanna species. And that the vast majority or the major population of these species occurs outside areas that are under the Forest Department control, either as reserve forests or as protected areas, national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. In fact, our analysis shows, when we did this mapping of ONEs, we found that less than 10% of India's ONEs come under the formal protected area network of India. Now, obviously, there's a huge gap, then there's a mismatch. You claim, you can't protect a species without also protecting its habitat. This lack of thinking or this lack of framing in terms of what habitats to protect for which species has then resulted in the problem that we see now, where the great Indian bustard is almost on the verge of extinction. Its numbers might be down to 150, maybe less. The habitat that it inhabits, such as the Thar Desert or what it used to inhabit in Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh and Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, all of those have been rapidly converted to other uses. The populations have severely dwindled across their range. And now there's a last-ditch effort through conservation breeding to at least secure some part of its population as a captive population. So the policies that the sort of did not recognize open natural ecosystems as a rightful form of ecosystem have also resulted in the species that depend on them disappearing. The same is the case for the Indian wolf. The Indian wolf is an apex predator of the grasslands. Now that the cheetah, which was once extinct, but they're trying to bring them back slowly. But throughout most of India, the wolf remains the apex predator. And their numbers are also probably down to less than 3,500 to 4,000 individuals. And they're imperiled by the same problems: lack of habitat, almost no prey. They're almost entirely dependent on domestic animals, and very worryingly, disease from free-ranging domestic dogs and hybridization with domestic dogs are the major threats for the conservation of the Indian wolf.
So since you mentioned the Indian cheetah, there's been a narrative made that bringing the cheetah reintroducing the cheetah will help conserve grasslands. What is your opinion about this, given that our grasslands already have charismatic species and open natural ecosystems as a whole?
I think we need to turn this on its head a little bit. Although we brought the cheetahs in with great fanfare, and the population is slowly growing in India, their current distribution will continue to be limited to a few protected areas, which are savannas, in Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan and so on. But for a truly viable, free-ranging population of cheetahs to establish, we have to look beyond the protected area network. We have to look at actually the hundreds of square kilometers of open savanna ecosystems or open grassland ecosystems that are currently present in India, which could potentially form a habitat for these species 10 years down the line, but which need to be protected right now. So you cannot expect to have a stable, viable cheetah population in India if you're not protecting the grassland which it's supposed to depend on, and which it's supposed to be a flagship of. Once you start protecting these grasslands, and by protection I don't mean make them into wildlife sanctuaries. All I mean is prevent unnecessary land conversion and prevent perverse subsidies or perverse incentives from taking over these lands. And work very closely with local communities who are dependent on them. Because without the pastoralists, the grasslands also disappear. Okay. In fact, if the pastoralists disappear, so do the Indian wolves. They're all very closely tied together. This has been a partnership that's gone on for thousands of years. So we shouldn't upset that balance. And India is a lived ecology. It's not what you see in National Geographic documentaries where there's only wildlife and no people. No, India, in every ecosystem in India, there are people who are part of that ecosystem and who have shaped that ecosystem. So you cannot think of conservation without people's livelihoods and their lived experiences being accounted for. The models that we can think of are ones of community-led conservation, and where the communities then take ownership of the conservation of these landscapes, and they benefit from it, either from ecotourism or through some innovative finance mechanism for climate, for example, the green credits program or biodiversity bonds or carbon credit schemes or whatever it is. Some forms of innovative schemes can come in that give them incentives for land sparing and land sharing. And these models need to now be promoted in India at a larger scale, because the future of conservation in India is going to be outside its national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. It's going to be amongst the people where wildlife has always coexisted.
So you mentioned a green grade scheme, which transitions well into my next question about tree planting in India. So there's been a major push for afforestation across India, but there's been issues with planting the wrong trees in a wrong location. So talk about how unscientific afforestation projects can affect open natural ecosystems?
So, the term afforestation to me is as problematic as the term desertification. Because afforestation, what it does is it glorifies one type of ecosystem, and desertification denigrates another type of ecosystem. The term afforestation implies that you create a forest when none existing, and that's problematic. The term desertification implies that something turning into a desert is problematic, is a bad thing, when in fact a desert is also a natural ecosystem. What one refers to is reversing degradation, the other one is causing degradation. So we need to start understanding these terms in a more nuanced, ecologically sensitive manner. So I have a problem with the term afforestation. We should not be doing afforestation. We should be doing ecological restoration. And ecological restoration then means that you should first examine what was the basal state of that ecosystem that you want to restore. If it's a savanna, then restore it to a savanna. If it's a forest of a certain type, then try and restore it to that type of forest. One should try and, especially if your goal is to restore them to their natural ecologies. This is not the same as creating these so-called Miyawaki gardens in cities and so on. Those are very different things, and they are not the same. So, hyper dense tree plantations that are supposedly going to compensate for the loss of forest in other areas is ecologically unsound. And unfortunately in India, because most land that can be planted with trees is seen as where the wastelands are, then unfortunately the open natural ecosystems are also targeted for this tree plantation programs, and often is the wrong tree. It's trees that people think should be in the right place, even if they're native. So, for example, people plant pongamia or neem or banyan trees in very, very dry habitats, and none of these are going to survive. In fact, they will make problems worse. So not only now have you destroyed a forest for whatever developmental activity you want to do, but now by creating this compensatory afforestation, you're also going to destroy a natural open ecosystem. And by planting trees there at very high densities, you're actually going to create further problems for the ecology of that landscape, including a reduction in available water, because trees draw a lot of water from the soil. So instead of improving the water situation, you actually reduce subsurface water availability in these landscapes. So one needs to have a very landscape-centric and ecosystem-specific idea of restoration. And there's lots of very, very good examples in India of where this is being practiced. The work that's been done, for example, in the Rao Jodha Park in Jodhpur, the Aravali Biodiversity Park, some of the work that we are doing here in Maharashtra and Rajasthan and Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, they all speak to restoring ecologies of those landscapes with keeping in mind what those landscapes' basal state is, and not by trying to impose our own imagination of what that landscape should look like. So it's important not just think of trees when thinking of restoration, but think of all the other life forms that can also be restored to those areas. And they needn't be trees. It could be grass, it could be shrubs. Sometimes doing nothing is just as good.
So coming back to the green credit scheme, so what is the current status of it, and how can it be improved to incorporate ATREE beyond forests?
So the green credit scheme is really forward-looking piece of policy that has been promoted by the government, where a company or an entity can gain green credits, by promoting some sort of restoration activity. Now, unfortunately, that restoration activity is still confined to planting trees, although the MOEF has issued a clarification that you can also, where appropriate, also plant grasses and trees and shrubs and so on. So we need to now push for the better implementation of the Green Credit program, so that ecological restoration can be done in a better way, in a more ecosystem specific way.
Now, coming to all the work you are doing on grassland restoration. So, ATREE has been involved in the grassland restoration efforts in the Super, in many places, such as the Super Wildlife Sanctuary in Maharashtra and the Kendur Village Commons. Could you talk about what makes grassland restoration effective and elaborate on some of these projects and what key challenges you have faced so far?
So the idea that we can restore grasslands is very appealing for us, of course, because we realize that although we contest the fact that grasslands are degraded forests, we say very loudly that they're not, that these are not degraded forests, they're naturally grasslands. But even grasslands can be degraded. And this is what we are seeing throughout most of central and peninsular India, that because of years of neglect and overuse or misuse, most of our grasslands have become degraded. And we wanted to try and see how we can reverse some of this degradation by doing active restoration in these landscapes. So this is where we started with the process of consulting with local communities and with other stakeholders. So for example, with the Forest Department in Maharashtra, who are in the Pune Wildlife Division, is an active collaborator in this work. The Pune Divisional Commissioner's Office is an active collaborator. We also have collaborators in Rajasthan, such as, for example, the Bikaner Forest Division or the Karni Mata Temple Trust, and several others who have given us access to lands where we can do this kind of restoration. And for us, the first thing we thought of was, doing surveys to understand what is missing from these areas. So what types of grasses were found here earlier that are no longer found here, and can we bring them back? And most of these tend to be the palatable, perennial, tussock forming grasses, which are sort of the first to go when land gets degraded. So these are again all native species that we've brought back into nursery. We sort of created nurseries to grow them in, and we are doing a combination of seed dispersal as well as active planting of slips and saplings of grasses in all of these areas. And we're seeing fairly remarkable results in a very short period of time. Just sometimes even in just one rainy season, you can see very robust regeneration in these landscapes. And we're finding that there's immense benefits. People already report higher amounts of biomass available. We can see that biodiversity indices are improving. We can see that soil carbon is improving in these areas. In fact, in one study that we did in Maharashtra, where with CAMPA funding, again, very with great foresight, the CAMPA authority in Maharashtra had used CAMPA funds for grassland restoration. And we found that just within 3 years, you could more than double the, you could increase, in just 3 years, you could see an almost 50% increase in soil organic carbon in these areas. So again, massive benefits for soil health by doing something as low cost as grassland restoration. So other benefits that we can see are improved water infiltration into the soil, improved runoff, and so higher water availability in streams and so on. So this is all ongoing work, and we hope to replicate this or have these showcased as models for application to other departments and other agencies and other NGOs who are working in this space.
So in 2025, you and your team published a research paper on the carbon sequestration potential of grassland restoration in the Bani landscape in, I think, Rajasthan. Could you just elaborate upon this and why grassland restoration is such a good climate indicator strategy, and how do invasive species affect grassland restoration?
So this study that you're referring to was actually carried out in the Kutch area of Gujarat, in the Banni grasslands. Now, Banni at one point of time was one of the largest tropical grassland areas in Asia, but because of, again, the idea that grasslands were never seen as natural habitats, They were actively planted with Prosopis juliflora, now called Neltuma juliflora, to be converted into as like a green barrier. And this, of course, created lots of problems for the local population, the Maldhari of that landscape. Their livestock suffered, the grassland suffered, the grassland fauna suffered. So, we've been working in that landscape for, since the early 2000s. And so the study that we did there, we found that when grasslands are restored, either by local or by the local Maldhari themselves or actively through other means, then the soil carbon profiles of those landscapes are very, very high compared to areas that are either degraded or which have Prosopis juliflora in them. So, contrary to what people might believe, the planting of Prosopis juliflora did not result in increased soil carbon. Although above ground there is more carbon, but a lot of this carbon is also lost because this Prosopis is then cut and used for making charcoal. But the below ground carbon remains stable. And we found that Banni has some of the highest below ground carbon reserves of almost any ecosystem in India, and rivaling many forest areas.
So India is making fairly ambitious pushes to shift towards renewable energy, with solar farms and windmill farms popping up in various parts of India, which tends to affect grasslands, especially because a lot of these open natural ecosystems do get a lot of sunlight, such as in Ladakh and Rajasthan. So how do you think India can balance the green energy goals with grassland and open natural ecosystem conservation?
So, India has become a global leader in the clean energy transition revolution, and this is really commendable. And we have got very ambitious targets to, we almost convert to almost 50% green energy, renewable energy by 2030 or something like that. But the flaw in that policy, though, was that green energy was seen as being green only from one perspective, in terms of how the energy was produced, that it's renewable, that it doesn't have a fossil fuel imprint. But the siting of those energy plants obviously have some footprint, especially if they are solar power plants, because they require huge amounts of land. India is land scarce, and one of the policies that was implemented to promote this kind of green energy was that they were exempt from ecological impact or environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment. So this resulted basically in any land being declared open for plantations, for creating the solar power plants. And what this did was, it coupled with the wasteland atlas of India and the wasteland categorization of the grasslands, and classified all of these. So all the ones that are classified as wastelands were then made open, available to promoters for creating very large solar power plants. Unfortunately, this resulted in the destruction of hundreds of square kilometers of very valuable open habitat, including desert grasslands, savanna grasslands, and other even forest areas along the western ghats for windmills and such other things. All in the name of green energy. But if you look at where else they could have been sited, I think this was a lacuna. We could have easily identified areas where green energy plants could have been sited, basically over grey land. That means where infrastructure has already been built, rather than putting it in brown land or green land where you would have to break ground de novo. So that was a policy lacuna, and I hope that it will be corrected soon, because otherwise we end up losing thousands of square kilometers of very productive land area that millions of people are highly dependent on, for something that can easily be put somewhere else. So, for example, all of our infrastructure, urban landscapes can be covered with solar panels. We can be innovative in where we put them and the kinds of design of solar panels that we use. So, for example, now there are these vertical solar panels that can be put on agricultural fields, so that farmers can then derive extra income from those. Or you can practice something called agrivoltaic, where farmers can, where the solar companies put the solar panels on agricultural land, and farmers are then allowed to cultivate below that, some kinds of shade-friendly crops, and it's a win-win situation. So there are plenty of opportunities for innovation here, and I think we should grab them when we want to become leaders for renewable energy in India.
We're now moving more towards wildlife and its conservation. So you have worked a lot on mesocarnivores and their interactions with free-ranging dogs. So can you just talk about your research to see how free-ranging dogs impact native wildlife, particularly mesocarnivores?
So, when I was doing my PhD, I was like a typical wildlife biologist, very interested in the ecology of the mesocarnivore species. And, I've been studying them for some time now, particularly the Indian fox, but also the jungle cat, golden jackal, and others. And I found that, the most common carnivore I was seeing in the landscape, though, was the domestic dog. And my former PhD supervisor, the late Professor Gompa, he and I looked at this and we said, they must be having some impact on the wildlife, because dogs are a mid-sized carnivore in the landscape themselves. Even though they're domesticated, they still behave like predators. They still behave like carnivores. So they must be having some impact. So that's when I started documenting some of these impacts, and we found that they're fairly widespread impacts. My former PhD student, Dr. Chandrima Home, then went on to do a part of her PhD research on this as well. And a couple of others, including Dr. Chetan Mishra, started investigating the impacts of dogs on wildlife. And we did some fairly broad level surveys. We found that dogs are widespread predators of wildlife all across India and have been known to have impact on at least 88 species, but likely that's an underestimate because we only looked for confirmed predation or confirmed chasing. A more global study has found that dogs are responsible for the extinction of many species, I think at least 15. So, dogs can be a conservation problem in India. And there is no case to make that they're the number one conservation problem, but coupled with all the other changes that are happening and the fact that their population is increasing, they can put a lot of pressure on endangered wildlife, especially ground nesting birds. Say, for example, the Supreme Court recently highlighted that the great Indian bustard in Rajasthan should be protected at any cost, and that power lines need to be put underground. But in those same areas, there are also dogs that can potentially hunt chicks. Now, even if one wild chick or one egg is lost to an unnecessary predation, then that's a huge blow to the population. So, we do need to have a very considered and scientific policy for the management of dogs in wildlife areas. And this does not include the current ABC. That does not work. You can't sterilize and put them back in the same area. Sterilized dogs are going to continue to hunt and harass wildlife. So that's a no-brainer.
I think the discussion about how to manage dogs is that can be another podcast.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I won't say anything further on this because the matter is currently being heard by the Supreme Court. So, yeah.
So, but focusing more on your own research. So recently you were a part of a publication on the space use patterns of dogs in central India. So why don't you talk about the research and what implication it has for conservation?
So this project was part of a Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance project that I was looking at for understanding the ecology of dogs and rabies. And what we did was we put GPS collars on dogs in villages in Maharashtra. And what we found was that, the dogs almost function as if like two different populations. There's the village dogs that stay within the village and they barely move, just a few hundred meters every day. But then there are the farm dogs, or the dogs that are associated with farmlands or farmhouses, or villagers who have these little their homes in their farmlands. Those can roam several hundreds of meters or even kilometers a day, and those are the ones that are potentially likely to have a greater impact on wildlife, because they're also also moving a lot more into wildlife habitats. So this is an area of concern, and in terms of management action, it allows us to also better prescribe which kinds of populations we need to target from the wildlife conservation perspective.
So now coming to your career specifically, so what have been some of the key challenges you have faced across your career in conservation and the best memories?
Oh, for me, the challenges have always been in pushing a counter narrative to the mainstream. So, for example, if I said, stop, don't plant trees, people will look at me as if I'm crazy. Like, what kind of a conservationist are you that you're saying don't plant trees? But what we're saying actually is, you plant the right thing in the right place. So changing that narrative, trying to change people's perspective of what kinds of habitats are there, trying to bring much needed spotlight on grasslands in India. All of these have been major challenges, not just challenges to convince, mainstream conservationists have to be convinced, but then obviously the government has to be convinced. And so that's been a major challenge. Trying to also reframe the narrative around conservation in India, that, just protected areas will be enough to ensure the conservation of wild species in India is a myth that I would like to bust. That we actually need to think of India as a unique country where we have got some of the largest populations of megafauna, and the only reason they've continued to exist is because of the tolerance and for people to coexist with them, and for wildlife to learn to coexist with people. And we shouldn't let that go. We should promote that model. We should make that work. And the future of wildlife conservation in India is outside its protected area network, is outside the wildlife sanctuaries and national parks. And this is what we need to push for. My most memorable moments, I not just in terms of doing my research, I've obviously had great fun doing all this really excellent research on mesocarnivores and looking at the results as they first came up. But for me, what I gather a lot of satisfaction from is when we talk to policymakers now, and when we talk to people from other walks of life and show them the beauty of grasslands in India, and they say, "Oh, we didn't know anything about this. This is the first time I'm hearing of something of this." And these are people who've lived all their life in India. They've traveled extensively, but you're suddenly showing them the same landscapes in a different light. And it's great to see that kind of renewed sort of interest on these landscapes.
So that's a good way to end the podcast. Thank you so much for taking time out for this.
It's my pleasure.